By the winter of 1944, the German front in the West was no longer slowly retreating. In many places, it was simply coming apart. Vehicles were abandoned along village roads. Orders changed faster than they could be carried. Units that had once marched in columns now moved in small knots: clerks, drivers, medics, flak auxiliaries, even teenagers following whatever route seemed least likely to end under artillery fire. Surrender stopped being rare. In some districts, it became routine. Among those taken were women who had spent years hearing what American soldiers were supposed to do to prisoners. They expected rough treatment. They expected humiliation. Some expected worse. What unsettled them was that none of it happened right away. There were no crowds gathered to watch, no dramatic punishment, no shouting beyond simple instructions to keep moving. Just long, quiet walks away from the front, rifles carried low, boots crunching on frozen lanes while breath drifted white in the dark. Processing areas filled up faster than anyone could build proper camps. Farmyards, school halls, empty factories, open fields, strung with wire. Whatever could hold bodies for a night or two was pressed into service. Supplies ran thin. Shelter was poorer still. Winter came early, turning wet ground hard and slick, creeping through coats that had never been meant for nights outdoors. Men and women were separated quickly, not out of kindness, but because regulations demanded it and officers worried about what happened when exhausted crowds were packed too tightly together. The women were sent wherever space could be found, sometimes into seized houses, sometimes into canvas tents, sometimes into long wooden sheds that smelled of fresh boards and old manure and were clearly meant to be temporary. Inside one of those compounds, something happened that many of them would later remember more clearly than the moment they handed over their weapons. It was not an interrogation. It was not a beating. It was something smaller, and, at first, almost ridiculous. The building had once been used for storing farm tools and wagons. Now it was full of people. Rough boards made up the walls. Benches ran along the sides, unfinished planks nailed into place. No backs, no padding. The floor pulled heat straight out of boots that were already stiff from marching. Most of the women were thin from weeks of short rations. Some still wore skirts and coats meant for clerical work, not winter nights. Scarves were scarce, gloves almost non-existent. When they were told to sit, many did so gratefully, shoulders sagging as they finally stopped moving. For a little while, that was enough. Then the pain set in. The edges of the benches pressed into bone. Cold crept upward through cloth. Circulation faltered in hips and legs that had carried packs and rifles for days. Some women shifted again and again, searching for a position that hurt less. Others stood back up, deciding that standing was preferable. A few laughed under their breath, the brittle kind of laugh people make when they are too tired to care whether something is funny. Then someone said it, quietly, in German. Sitzen tut weh. Sitting hurts. It passed along the benches almost casually, part complaint, part joke. At first, the guards paid no attention. Most were young. Replacements or military police posted well behind the fighting. Their German extended to a few memorized commands, but discomfort is easy to read. The constant standing and sitting, the faces tightening, hands pressed into lower backs before lowering again. One guard finally motioned with his chin and spoke slowly. No one answered. A woman who had worked in offices before being assigned to an anti-aircraft unit tried to explain with gestures. She tapped the plank, then pressed her palm against her spine and made a small grimace. Another repeated the phrase, shaping the words carefully. Sitting. Hurts. The guard frowned. He stepped closer, dragged a gloved hand along the edge of the bench, felt a splinter snag. Then he put his palm flat against the wood and held it there for a second. Cold? He gave a short nod, as though confirming something to himself. And then he walked out. The room went quiet in a different way. People stared at the door. A few tugged collars higher. Others exchanged looks that said far more than words could. They had been raised in a system where complaining was dangerous and weakness could draw punishment. Propaganda had been relentless. Americans, they had been told, were undisciplined and vindictive. Captives were supposed to keep their heads down and endure. Speaking up was meant to make things worse. Time dragged. Outside, boots continued to crunch back and forth. Rifles shifted. No one returned. The benches stayed just as hard. Cold crept back in. Fingers stiffened where hands rested uselessly in laps. One woman stood and did not bother sitting again. Another wrapped her arms around herself and rocked slightly without realizing she was doing it. Whispers followed the walls. Had they angered him? Was someone about to be pulled out? Were questions coming? Punishment? The fear was not loud. It was dense, pressing inward as steadily as the temperature dropped. Then the doors opened again. Two Americans hauled a crate across the frozen yard between them. Wood scraped against gravel. A third followed with a bulky bundle slung over his shoulder. Steam poured from their mouths as they worked. They tipped the crate. Blankets spilled out. Thick wool, olive-colored, folded into heavy rectangles stamped with markings the prisoners did not recognize. Not German issue, army issue. Another soldier rolled in a metal drum while someone else struck a match and fed scraps of wood inside. Flames caught, smoke curling toward the rafters and heat spreading unevenly across the floor. No explanation came with it. No lecture. One of the guards only made a small circling motion with his hand. Wrap yourselves. Warm up. For a second, nobody moved. Caution ran deep, but cold ran deeper. Then one of the women stepped forward and pulled a blanket around her narrow shoulders. She drew in a breath that sounded half like relief and half like surprise, as though she had not expected the warmth to be real. Others followed. Blankets were passed hand to hand. Small groups gathered near the barrel, holding numb fingers toward the uneven heat. Blood returned in sharp, burning stabs that made several of them hiss, then laugh softly at the same time. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that meant feeling was coming back. From the doorway, the guard watched for a moment, then leaned against the frame again, as if the matter were already settled and no longer required his attention. Inside the shed, something shifted. Relief, certainly, but also something harder to name. Unease, confusion, and the first quiet crack in ideas that had taken years to build. The blankets did not make the building warm. They made it survivable. People slept in their coats, breath still fogged beneath the rafters. The floor continued to pull heat from anyone who lay still for too long. But the worst of the cold no longer owned the room, and that difference mattered more than anyone wanted to admit aloud. By morning, the yard outside was tracked with frozen mud and overlapping footprints. A medic walked slowly along the line, shining a light on fingers and toes, pausing whenever skin looked too pale, too waxy. Those with soaked boots were told to loosen them during rest periods. Damp socks were laid near heaters when there was space. A thin, hot drink appeared from a field kitchen and vanished just as quickly. None of it felt generous. It felt procedural. Orders were short and repeated the same way every time. Where to stand, when to move, when to wait. Guards raised their voices only when someone drifted out of line or failed to understand an instruction the first time. Food remained basic soup, bread, tins opened with pocket knives when nothing else was available. Hunger never really left. Letters from home did not arrive. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still rumbled. The war pressed on, indifferent to blankets and fire barrels. What unsettled many of the prisoners was not hardship. It was Predictability. They began to notice patterns. Infractions brought consequences, but the consequences followed rules rather than tempers. One person stepped out of line, and only that person was corrected. There were no group punishments, no random displays meant to frighten everyone at once. For people raised in a system where authority relied on spectacle and fear, this felt strange. More medical checks followed. Lice were dealt with briskly and without commentary. Frostbitten skin was wrapped and marked for follow-up. During long halts, the women were allowed to remove their boots so feet could dry, something almost unthinkable in the army they had left behind. Awkward practicalities rarely mentioned in official reports, but remembered clearly decades later, were handled quietly through Red Cross parcels, or improvised solutions that drew embarrassed glances from both sides. The guards did not linger during those moments. They turned away. Behind the scenes, the system running the temporary camps strained under its own weight. Processing units drowned in paperwork, and people alike as front lines rolled forward. Officers inspected compounds. Reports were written. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Complaints were logged and sometimes acted upon, sometimes buried beneath everything else that demanded attention. It was not a smooth machine. Overcrowding spread illness. Fuel shortages left stoves cold on bad nights. Some camps moved before their structures were ever properly finished. But intention showed itself in small choices. Extra blankets instead of bare floors. Dry socks instead of frozen boots. A flashlight checking toes in the dark. Those were the details that stayed. Years later, when these women tried to describe their captivity, many did not begin with wire or guards or interrogations. They began with temperature, with the first night, with hands that stopped working and the shock of being allowed to warm them. Some wrote that it forced them to rethink what they had been taught. Others admitted to guilt at being treated decently while knowing what had been done elsewhere in their country's name. A few refused to analyze it at all, recording events and leaving interpretation to someone else. Yet the same moments surfaced again and again. The fire barrel, the wool blanket, the shrug from a guard who did not seem to think he had done anything worth remembering. In the sweep of the war, none of it changed strategy. No offensives turned because someone noticed numb fingers. No cities fell because benches were softened or socks were dried. History rarely pauses for such things. But for the women who stood shivering in a yard and then felt warmth creep back into their hands, something shifted. The enemy became less monstrous. Authority became less arbitrary. Survival stopped feeling like a test of suffering and began to resemble endurance. After the war, most of those women returned to civilian lives that left little room for explanation. Some rebuilt families, some stayed silent. Some mentioned captivity only once or twice in a lifetime. But in letters and interviews gathered decades later, one idea kept resurfacing. They had expected worse. What they received was routine. And in war, that difference could be everything. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing for more overlooked moments from the conflict. Small details that rarely make headlines, but linger long after the guns fall silent.